So first of all, I just wanted to point out that it's really no different than any other kind of economic good that we would be interested in managing or using. It's scarce, just like anything else. It's not special in that way. It's scarce, just like any other kind of economic good. We could always want more of it, and there are competing uses of it. There's different end uses that have different values. Drinking, you might argue, is the most essential. That's something that obviously we can't do without. But we also use water to grow food. We also use water to generate electricity if we're damming up a river and using the gravity, the thrust of the water as it moves downhill. We're using that to harness and create energy. Water is also useful for being able to transport goods down a river, load things up on a ship and send them downriver. So you need to have water. You need to have some water. It's like some amount of water available in the river in order to be able to sustain a certain mass of a boat that you'd want to take down that river and have it be navigable by boat. It's also a habitat for wildlife, not just for commercial fishing, but also for just ecosystems and the health of ecosystems generally. And so water has all these different competing uses. There's different ways that we can put it to use. Some of them are non-consumptive. Let me just write this. This is an important distinction, non-consumptive. So, like using water for transportation is basically, a non-consumptive use. It's not diverting the water away from the water course or the river. It's just using it in place, not taking it out. That's somewhat true also for electricity generation. Although, if you're, for example, if you're withdrawing water, to cool a power plant or to cool some of your manufacturing or industrial processes, if you're withdrawing water in order to cool something, you're changing the quality of it. So if you send it back into the river, you're not sending it back into the river perhaps the same way that you took it out. You might be sending it back a lot hotter, which could have some implications for the health of the ecosystem. If you're sending hotter water back into the river than you took out, there's various ways that's can be detrimental with heat pollution and kind of tampering with the ecosystem environment a little bit. So those are, even though you're putting it back, it's not necessarily the same thing. And so you could think of that as somewhere between non-consumptive and consumptive. But yeah, this salmon habitat would also be an example of something that's non-consumptive. You just need the water there in order to sustain the fish population. But of course, a lot of other uses of our water, the drinking and the irrigation are, I'll put those in red. Drinking and irrigation are uses of water that you're definitely taking it out of the water course, out of the ground or out of the stream, or out of the lake, and you're putting that to use on land, and it's not, it's being used up. So there's definitely competing uses of water, but there's also some ways in which the uses can be complementary, and that's going to be important for managing water efficiently. So that's my first point about the fact that there are trade-offs between different uses. The second point I want to make, so water, biologically, organisms and people need water to survive. It's a necessity in a way, but there's only a very small amount of our actual use of water, which actually goes towards what we might call essential or necessary uses, like drinking. A lot of it goes towards watering lawns, being able to keep golf courses, watering crops, which we feed to cattle and pigs, which is debatable whether or not that's something that we actually absolutely have to do. So even though it's necessary for life, it's important to remember that not all uses of water are necessary for life. Like the 40th minute of the shower is not as important as the first couple liters that you get in order to drink to kind of keep yourself alive. And so that's going to be important to keep in mind as we're thinking about using it well. Using it well means putting it towards the things that are extremely valuable. And if we have a scarce amount, we want to make sure that we're taking care of the things that are extremely valuable first before we're using it for other things sort of down the line. Gardens and lawns are great, but they're not as important as having water for drinking or cooking or washing. And if we have enough, of course, it's great. We can use it for keeping our lawns green. But if it's scarce, we ought to have some mechanisms that would allow water to be reallocated toward the places where it's most valuable. So those are just a couple kind of introductory comments as you're thinking about this issue. I want to just take inventory a little bit think about what are the actual supplies of water that are on the planet. We have a lot of water that's salty. We can't, like 97% of it is oceans we can't use. 3% of it is fresh, drinkable, usable. However, a lot of that is frozen. Unfortunately, we don't really have access to that. So a lot of that, even a lot of that 3% of the fresh water, is locked up in ice caps and glaciers. And then about this 30% of the 3% is kind of what we have available to us for use. And so we have a limited supply, especially when you consider it relative to all the water that's actually on the planet, whether it's in the oceans or in the ice caps. Another way to think about it is there's always evaporation happening, and there's always water falling back to Earth through rainfall. And the evaporation actually that happens on the oceans is larger than what happens on land, and precipitation is distributed about evenly. And so there's actually like a net transfer of water from the oceans to the land in terms of evaporation from the oceans and then rainfall, precipitation falling back on the land. So the continents, the continents lose a lot of water every year through evaporation. They lose 70,000 cubic kilometers per year. That's what evaporates off the continents of the planet every year. But there's actually a larger amount that falls down as precipitation on the Earth. And so that precipitation is about 110,000 cubic kilometers per year, which is about 40,000 cubic kilometers per year of a net transfer from the oceans to the land. So you can think about this 40,000 as kind of our renewable stock of water that we're pretty much guaranteed to have every year. This is just a hydrological phenomenon where you have 40,000 cubic kilometers more precipitation than evaporation on the continents, on the land. So 40,000 cubic kilometers, we have to consider that some of that's going to run off very quickly as floods, and it's not actually available for us to directly use. So if you take out two-thirds of that 40,000 cubic kilometers, you're left with about 13,000 cubic kilometers. And if you divide that by kind of the population, we have about 1,700 cubic meters per person per year available for use. This is the renewable component of water that's available every single year. Okay, and I'll try to put those numbers a little bit more in context later. I'll have some context for kind of how large those numbers are. I'll just start by just noting that there's different distributions of this water on different parts of the planet. So this 1,700 cubic meters is an average. That's sort of the average amount around the globe, but it actually varies a lot. So I'll put that number back up here. 1,700 meters cubed per person is kind of what it is on average, but it's a lot less than that, for areas of the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. But then it's also a lot more than that for other places. Europe, Latin America, North America get quite a bit more than this 1,700 average number. So it's a fixed amount that's sort of renewed every single year, recharged. You can think of it as being recharged every year. We get a new supply of renewable water every single year, transferring from the oceans to the land, but it's not distributed evenly across the globe. So I just wanted to start with that, just some context for kind of what we're dealing with in terms of the size of these water resources. So given that we have a fixed amount, given that we have only so much that's sort of falling down as rain in every single year, given that that's the case, we have to figure out how to use it wisely, and we have to consider the fact that our populations are growing as well. We have growing populations, and so the demand is growing. I want to open this up just for a second to the class and get some of your thoughts on what, if you were a water manager, if you're trying to manage the water supply for a city or a town that you're in charge of, what are some of the things at your disposal? What are some of the tools that you might be using in order to make sure that there's enough water for the future, not just for the present, but also perhaps for growing future populations? What are some of the things that you might be doing to ensure that you have sufficient water supplies?
You would probably discourage water contamination.
From what kind of sources of contamination?
I'm not really sure, I guess, what power a water manager would have over, say, like a city, but say they're saying, like, don't dump your trash in the water? That's a very like simple example,
Yeah.
but like something along the lines of that.
Yeah, so. Yeah, certainly, if it's scarce, you're going to want regulations that are protecting the quality, that aren't diminishing the small stocks that you have. So yeah, maybe you get your water from a groundwater aquifer that's underneath your town. You might be trying to regulate the nitrates, or the nitrogen fertilizer that could potentially seep down into the ground from nearby farmland, or maybe chemical contamination from industrial processes. You might be, for example, if you're in Pennsylvania, you might have natural gas companies trying to drill wells, natural gas wells in various parts of your landscape, and you're going to be wanting to make sure that there's not contamination from those processes that get in the water. So yeah, protection of the existing supplies. It's going to be something that's going to ensure that you're not making it even more hard for yourself to get more water in the future. So yeah, thanks Maria for that. Is there anyone else that has any ideas about what you might do as a water manager to ensure supplies? Yep.
Yeah, I think you could perhaps like make a ban on unnecessary use of water to basically just to water lawns, so that sort of like aesthetic value.
Yeah, so you might have regulations or certain times of low rainfall periods where you might decide like we're not going to allow lawn watering or sprinklers in your yard at all for that use when we have this drought happening, or it's been several months since we had a good rainfall, and so we're kind of our water supplies are running a little bit low. We might want to ban certain uses of water that are thought of as less valuable. I believe Adam in the chat talking about reservoirs. Yeah, having a kind of stocking up supplies. Maybe if you have a river that's flowing past your city, you might dam that river and divert water from that river and kind of store it in a reservoir pond or something like that, which then you can draw from. That can be a supply of water that you can draw from as you need it, kind of as you run low on some of your supplies. So that would be kind of a supply side measure. Outdoor water bans would be something more like a demand side measure. You could think of the protection of existing supplies as being also kind of a supply side measure as well. So I'll get to some more measures in a second. I just want to put that 1700 what I want to do next is I want to put this 1700 cubic meters per person number in a little bit of context. Kind of that's the average global renewable resources of water that we have available every single year. Now, there are, hydrologists and people that study the movement of water around the world and kind of the evaporation and precipitation patterns, and they observe kind of also the consumption patterns that are prevalent around the world. They recommend that 2,000 cubic meters per person is kind of what is required to comfortably sustain a modern population. That's kind of what is recommended, quote unquote recommended, by hydrologists. And remember that we had about 1,700 cubic meters per year in terms of our renewable flows of water that we get every single year. In that regard, you might think that we're actually already a little bit stretched in our water resources as it is, given that we have less than this recommended amount that hydrologists recommend of 2,000 cubic meters per person per year relative to the 1,700 that sort of fall back onto land from the oceans. If this 2,000 cubic meters per year is the amount that's required for a comfortable water supply, 1,000 to 1,700 is what is considered water stressed. You're considered to be water stressed if you have 1,000 to 1,700 cubic meters per person per year. There's also a tier below that, which is water scarcity. You're considered to be water scarce country or water scarce area if you have less than 1,000 cubic meters per year. These are cubic meters per person per year. There's a level below that where they classify it as absolute water scarcity if you have supplies that are less than 500 cubic meters per person per year. And then there's something also below less than 300 cubic meters per person per year. Does anyone know what this is called when you have less than 300 cubic meters per year? It doesn't have a technical name, but this is actually what Israel has. So Israel is able to sustain sufficient water supplies and have a robust and thriving agricultural sector, and they have less than 300 cubic meters per person per year of renewable water supply. Israel is in a position where they have much less than this hydrologic recommended amount of 2,000. They have something like one sixth or less of this 2,000 2,000 amount. And they have been able to, with a lot of effort, it hasn't been easy or cheap or free, but they have been able to very prudently manage their water system in order to not just meet the needs of the domestic sector, the households that require water for drinking and cooking and washing, but they also have, a lot of agriculture that they've built up over time. And so I think it's just worth taking a second to talk a little bit about what Israel has done and the kinds of the techniques that they've used for bringing this about, beating the odds, you might say, where the hydrologists would say that it's impossible to be able to sustain a comfortable standard of living at less than 2,000 cubic meters per person per day. We have an example in Israel, which is kind of the model for water management around the world, which is able to do that for 1/6 or 1/7 of what this hydrologist recommended amount of water is. So it's also just worth pointing out that certain regions of Israel, especially the north, these regions get quite a bit of water. They get around 20 to 25 inches of rainfall per year, which is actually pretty wet. But that wet area is really confined to the north, and a lot of the country is closer to this less than 5 inches of rain, a lot more arid. And so they have a problem with the spatial distribution of water, where a lot of the water is located in the north, but they have a huge part of the country that's located elsewhere that also needs reliable water. So spatially, there's a little bit of a problem. And also in terms of the timing, there's also only 5 months of the year typically are rainy, and about 7 months of the year are dry. And because they have so little, they have around less than 300 cubic meters per person per day, they have to use what they have very carefully. They have to be very careful about the kinds of uses that they're putting it towards, and also making sure that they're looking for ways of building up their supplies through other means, not just through rainfall and storage in lakes and aquifers. But one of the things that has allowed Israel to do this very well, they have a very top-down strategy in the way that they've dealt with water. They have a very expansive and comprehensive sort of water network that they've built. You can think of it like blood vessels in a body, which take water from the wet north, and it's sort of distributes it to the southern and central parts of the country through kind of a centralized distribution network. And they built this back in the 1960s, even when they were back in the 60s, Israel was still a pretty poor country. And as they were kind of looking at their future prospects as a country and thinking about what were important strategic resources for them going forward, they realized that they would have to have a good water distribution network in order to have a prosperous nation. And so they actually, in the 60s, back when they were still very poor, they invested a huge amount of money into building this kind of central distribution network to deal with this spatial asymmetry between having a lot of water in the north but not a lot in the south, and also having a lot of water kind of at very short times during the year. And so they sunk a lot of money. They nearly bankrupted themselves in doing this, but it allowed them to kind of have a foundation for going forward, having a way to distribute water to where it's needed and siphon it from where it's available to where it's not, in order to spread out the water supplies a little bit more evenly across space. So that was one piece of the puzzle, was their kind of a vigorous effort on the part of the central government to build a very strong central distribution network that could act as like a pipeline for the whole country, kind of like the blood vessels to get water where it needs to go. So that was one thing, the centralized kind of top-down infrastructure building. Another thing that Israel does extremely well is that they match the quality of their water to the end use very well. So it's not necessary that you have every use of your water be drinkable. You only drink a certain amount of the water, and so you use water and you clean it up to the point that you need it clean, but you don't go any further than that. You don't clean it up more than is sort of required for the use that you're putting it towards. So drinking water, they clean to a high level of purity. But for other uses, they actually are, I think a recent number is that they find ways to recycle about 80% of their wastewater, 80% wastewater recycling. And so they might take the raw sewage and treat that to a certain level of quality, but not to drinkable quality. But then after they're done treating the wastewater in a first stage primary way, they can then use that water for other purposes, like for irrigation. So it's not required that irrigation water have the same level of quality as, for example, drinking water. So they can use some of that recycled wastewater towards uses that don't require it to be as pure, like for irrigation or sort of outdoor. You might think of them broadly as outdoor uses. So that's one sort of key strategy that they use to manage the scarce water that they have very well. So this is one possibility for substitution or adaptation to their current scarcity. So matching quality to end use is one. Just adapting their agricultural sector to a water scarce environment. There's been a lot of investments in biotechnology in Israel to produce seeds and have crops available that have a little bit higher drought tolerance or are able to cope with water stress better than maybe traditional kinds of seeds or traditional kinds of crops. That's another avenue for substituting away from water is instead of finding new supplies, you just adapt kind of what you're already doing in a way that gives you less of a urgent need for water. One kind of interesting anecdote about this bullet point is that Israel makes a lot of dates, the fruit, and dates grow very well in brackish water, or they tolerate brackish water very well. Brackish water is kind of salty water. It's not something you'd want to drink. It's a little bit salty, and it turns out that dates, more than other kinds of crops, are able to grow under conditions of being fed brackish water a lot better than other kinds of crops. And so this is, again, a kind of a different margin of substitution where your economy, you sort of adapt your economy to the conditions you have and do your best to cope with that, finding adaptations and finding substitutions for kind of other crops that would be more thirsty, requiring a lot more water than others. Right, so that's kind of some of the sorts of wastewater recycling, adapting their agricultural sector. They've also built a large number of, it's not a large number, but relatively speaking, it's a large number. They've built five desalination plants in the last 20 or so years, which is a lot. So the U.S. has tried to build a desalination plant. I believe the San Diego area has been trying to build a desalination plant for about 20 years now, and they're still kind of tied up in litigation, and they haven't been able to get that off the ground yet. Whereas Israel, over the course of around 10 years, was able to build 5 desalination plants and kind of get that part of their economy up to speed, get that part of their water sector up to speed. And their desalination plants supply, I believe it's around maybe 70% of their domestic consumption is fed by desalination. So they are investing quite a bit, not just in distribution systems and wastewater recycling and agricultural biotechnology. They're also investing a lot in desalination, and that's allowing them to get more from less in a way, get water from the Mediterranean Sea, turn that into drinkable water, and use that for meeting their growing populations. There's other kinds of, I guess you can kind of think of these as classified as supply side measures. In terms of the demand side, in Israel, they charge very high fees for their water, and they have to. Remember, they only have 300 cubic meters per person per year, and so water is inherently scarce, and they price it like it's scarce. So they don't artificially subsidize it to make people feel better about using water. They actually charge reasonably steep prices, and what that leads to is people really valuing their water. They really value their water. If you ask someone in Israel what the price of water is, they'll know off the top of their head, because it's a large part of their lives, and they have to pay a lot for it. And it causes them to use it more prudently. They value it more. They conserve it, they value it, and they use it efficiently when they face high water prices. One other kind of technique that they use, which is kind of interesting, is a little bit of an education campaign. In the newspapers in Israel, in the meteorology sections of the newspaper, every day they give the level of the Sea of Galilee, which is kind of like a proxy or a variable that represents kind of how much water they have in their reserves. And it's always lower than you'd like it to be. It's always a low amount. And the information is put out there to say, look, we have not an infinite supply of water here. We have a very, very low stocks of water in our reserves. That's just a reminder that water is scarce. You kind of see that in the newspaper every day. You're reminded of it, and it becomes part of your culture, part of your lifestyle to treat water in a way that values it and conserves it. So publishing the level of the Sea of Galilee in their newspapers is one kind of informational campaign that they employ, in addition to a lot of these other strategies that I've just mentioned. So this is all to say that this idea of this recommended 2,000 cubic meters per person per year, it's a little bit of a meaningless number. We don't have as much water as we would perhaps like, and at 2,000 cubic meters per person per year, we'd be using water for all kinds of things that we probably wouldn't need it for. And the insights of economics tell us that when things are scarce, we find ways of economizing on things, both on the demand side and on the supply side. We saw that in the non-renewable resource section of the course. We saw that when reserves are scarce, when prices of non-renewable materials are scarce, companies and consumers find ways of adapting to that and doing more with less. And water is no different. It's not a special kind of good in that way. It's an economic good, just like any other kind of economic good. And I think Israel kind of shows that these numbers here of these recommendations of how much water you actually need are a kind of meaningless numbers. They don't tell you the kind of dynamic sorts of adaptations and substitutions and management strategies that can be used to try to squeeze more value out of the smaller amounts of resources that you have. So that's I think that Israeli case study is just a really important reminder for what people can do with scarce resources when they set their mind to it, and when they employ economic reasoning and economic advised policy measures. I have this slide here on supply side management. We've already hit on a lot of these points in the course of talking about the Israeli case. Minimizing system leaks is one way that you can reduce your need to have greater and greater water supplies if you can get more out of it. Minimize your losses. This maybe goes to Maria's point about minimizing contamination as well. You might think about this as also minimizing contamination. Going out and building dams, building aqueducts and wells. Those can augment your supplies. That's a way to do it. Recycling wastewater, desalination. Those are techniques we just discussed. As far as the demand side, there are there's information campaigns. There's maybe public service announcements during particularly dry summers. You might have ads on the radio telling you to conserve your water. There's certain kinds of behavioral nudges you can also use where on your water bill, if you give people their water bill and show them how much water they're using relative to their neighbors, it can be kind of a way of incentivizing people to try to use less and kind of in a way maybe shaming them if they notice that, hey, I'm using 3 times as much water as my neighbor is. Maybe I'm being a little bit wasteful with it. Those kinds of things can be psychological sorts of measures that you can use as a policymaker, as someone that's trying to conserve water. We saw this, I think it was Jack who brought this up about the ideas of hiring water cops to go around and give people tickets for having their sprinklers running during a dry summer. That's maybe one way of discouraging certain kinds of uses. But from an economic point of view, pricing is one of the most powerful ways of getting people to use resources more carefully. It doesn't just incentivize conservation, but it incentivizes conservation in ways that people can choose for themselves how they want to do it. So you might decide that your outdoor water use isn't that valuable to you. And so if the water price is high, you're willing to cut back on that and you use that water for something else, or use that money for something else, use your income for something else rather than paying for expensive water to water your lawn. But maybe you really enjoy gardening, and maybe you really enjoy having the pleasure of mowing your lawn and curating your lawn, and that's something that you're willing to pay for. That's something that you're able to choose freely for yourself under a water pricing scheme. And so with prices, it's not just that you get an incentive to conserve and to cut back. You also just give people a menu of options, just like in the pollution control cases where we talked about how taxes give polluters choices about not just how much pollution they want to abate, but also what kinds of mechanisms they want to use. They're free to use whatever mechanisms are available to them. to abate their pollution. In the same way, prices can be used to give consumers of water, both businesses and industrial facilities and households, it can give those water customers choices about how they conserve their water and how they use their water. And that's just a lot less of a heavy-handed approach than kind of cracking down on particular kinds of behavior that you want to discourage. It gives people choices, it gives people options, and it lets them internalize the costs themselves if they wish to pay for it. If they find that the water is extremely valuable to them, they're free to use it how they wish. But they have to be careful because the price could be higher.